Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. I wanted to get away from the city for a few days, so I went camping in the mountains. The place I picked was quiet and surrounded by trees, with a small stream nearby. I set up my tent and built a fire. It was the peaceful kind of silence I had been hoping for. Just the sound of the wind moving through the leaves and the occasional bird calling out. The second day, I noticed something that didn't seem right. I was walking by the stream, not too far from my camp, when I saw large footprints in the mud. They were bear tracks and they looked fresh. That made my stomach tighten up a bit, but I reminded myself that bears live in these mountains. As long as I kept my food packed up and stayed alert, I'd be fine. That night, I couldn't really sleep. Every sound in the woods seemed louder than usual, closer, too. The rustling of leaves, the cracking of branches. It all made me feel like something was out there, watching me. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking it. But even then, I barely slept. The next morning, I checked my food and noticed something was wrong. A plastic container I had left by the tent had been torn open. There were deep teeth marks on it, and the lid was shredded. I didn't hear a thing last night, but it was clear the bear had been at my camp while I was asleep. That made my skin crawl. I cleaned up the mess, but now the tracks near my tent were larger than the ones I'd seen by the stream. The bear had come right up to my camp. The night after that was even worse. As I sat by the fire, I felt like the air was heavy. Felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I started hearing movement in the woods, something circling just beyond the light of the fire. Stayed out of sight, but I knew it was there. Whenever I started to calm down, I'd hear it again. The footsteps sounded heavy, slow, like it was moving on purpose, waiting for something. I barely slept again, and when I did, I kept having bad dreams. When morning came, I saw fresh claw marks on a tree right next to my tent. They were deep and hadn't been there the day before. The bear was getting closer, and it didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't acting like a normal bear. It wasn't just passing by. It was following me, stalking me. By this point, I was really scared. I knew I had to get out of there. I started packing up my camp, trying to hurry, when I heard it again. A deep, heavy breathing coming from the edge of the clearing. I looked up and saw it. The bear, standing just inside the tree line. It was staring at me, not moving. Its dark eyes locked on mine. It didn't flinch. It didn't leave. It just watched. I didn't even finish packing everything. I grabbed what I could and started moving as fast as I could down the trail. I knew it was behind me. I could hear its footsteps, slow but steady, getting closer. My heart was racing, but the weight of my backpack and the uneven trail made it hard to move fast enough. Every time I thought I was getting away, I'd hear it again, closer than before. Finally, I made it to a clearing near the edge of the mountain. I stopped and looked back. The bear was standing at the tree line, still watching. It hadn't come any closer, but it didn't leave either. Its head was low, its eyes following me. It wasn't acting like an animal anymore. Felt like it was waiting for me, like it knew something I didn't. I ran the rest of the way to my car and didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a curious bear. It had been hunting me, waiting for the right moment. And if I hadn't left that day, if I had stayed just one more night, I don't think I would have ever made it out of those mountains. It wasn't acting like a bear should. And as I think back on it, I realize it wasn't leaving me alone. It wasn't done. Whatever it wanted, it was still out there, watching, waiting, and I was lucky enough to get away. For now. It was late, and the rain had been pouring for hours. I was deep in the Amazon rainforest, somewhere in South America, setting up my camp for the night. I had a small tent, just big enough to keep me dry, and the sound of the rain hitting the fabric was almost comforting. I had camped in remote places before, but something about this night felt off. A strange feeling knotted in my stomach, making me think I wasn't alone. The thick trees loomed around me, their shapes hard to see in the darkness. The forest was alive with sounds. The rain hitting the leaves, the occasional crack of branches, and the constant buzz of insects. But under all of that, I could hear something else. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I had been hiking all day and was tired, maybe a bit paranoid for being so far away from civilization. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was footsteps, not close, but close enough to make my heart race. I strained to hear, but whenever the rain picked up, it drowned out the sound. I tried to tell myself it was just animals moving through the jungle, but the steps were too steady, too deliberate. It was someone walking, slowly, like they didn't want to be noticed. I zipped up my tent and lay still, listening. My flashlight was right next to me, and I grabbed it, my grip tight around it, unsure of what to do next. The footsteps came closer, stopped, then started again, like the person out there was hesitating. I didn't dare move. The rain slowed to a light drizzle, and the footsteps became clearer. I heard a soft rustle nearby, and I knew whoever it was had reached the edge of my camp. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't come closer, hoping they'd just leave. But then the rain picked up again, drowning out all sounds. Minutes turned into hours. I didn't sleep. The footsteps had stopped, but that awful feeling in my gut stayed. I couldn't hear anything else except for the rain, but I knew whoever or whatever it was hadn't gone far. When dawn finally broke, the rain stopped, and I unzipped my tent. The forest looked the same as it always did, thick and green, the trees covered in mist. But right outside my tent, in the mud, were footprints. Fresh ones. They were too big to be mine. I followed them for a short distance, but they vanished into the thick undergrowth, swallowed by the jungle. I hurriedly packed my things, not wanting to stay a moment longer than I had to. As I walked away, the sound of my own footsteps felt deafening, echoing in the silence left by the rain. With each step, I tried to shake off the feeling that someone had been watching me, but it never left. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding louder with each footfall. The forest felt alive, as if it were breathing, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the light was dim, like the sun was too afraid to break through. Just then, I heard it again, the footsteps. They were behind me, just out of sight. Panic gripped me as I glanced back, but there was nothing there, only the trees, dark and silent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in the mud. As I pressed on, I noticed something on the ground. More footprints, deeper this time, as if something heavy had passed through. My heart raced as I realized they didn't just lead away from my camp. They circled back toward it. The realization hit me like ice water. Something had been stalking me all night, circling my camp, watching. I sprinted forward, the sounds of the forest drowning in my own heartbeat. I could hear the branches snap behind me, feel the air shift as something moved through the trees. It was getting closer. Every instinct screamed to keep running, but I couldn't see where I was going. I could only hear the rush of rainwater and the pounding of something, or someone, close behind me. Finally, I burst into a clearing, the trees suddenly parting, and I turned around. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, shrouded in shadow, watching. It didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, still as a stone. I felt a chill creep over me, and I realized that whatever had been following me was no longer hiding. I took off again, racing toward the nearest trail, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart pounding and hands shaking. But as I drove away, I glanced back at the trees. They stood tall and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting for me to come back. We woke up just before the sun, the cold from the night still in the air as we packed our things for another day of hiking. The campsite was quiet, deep in the woods, far away from the usual noise of everyday life. We had been here for a few days now, exploring the area. I thought I had learned the trails pretty well, or at least I thought so. After eating, we headed toward a small open space we had found the day before. The plan was to spend the day there and return to camp later. First, everything seemed fine. The trees, the rocks, all the things I remembered seeing before passed by like they should. But after a while, something started to feel wrong. The trail didn't look as clear as I remembered. The trees seemed thicker, and the ground felt rougher, like we were walking somewhere we hadn't been before. We kept going, telling ourselves it was nothing, just our minds playing tricks. But after what felt like hours, we didn't end up at the clearing. Instead, the trail opened up into a part of the woods I didn't recognize at all. I checked the map, feeling confused. This place wasn't on it. We turned around, trying to go back the way we came, but nothing worked. Every time we turned, it led us deeper into the woods, deeper into somewhere I'd never seen before. My stomach started to twist with fear. Nothing looked familiar anymore. No trails, no markers, nothing. The sun kept climbing, and we kept moving, hoping we'd find something to lead us back. But the forest felt different now, like it was shifting around us. Paths that should have taken us one way suddenly led somewhere else, pulling us further away from where we wanted to be. Hours went by, and we were completely drained. It hit me then, we were lost. For real. No phone signal, no familiar sights. Just endless trees crowding in on us. I tried to stay calm, to think straight, but something didn't feel right. The feeling wasn't just that we were lost. It was like something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. As the sun started to dip, the air got colder. It wasn't just being lost that was messing with me anymore. Felt like we weren't alone. No animals were around. No birds. No wind. Just a heavy silence hanging in the air. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. The way the trails kept changing, how nothing matched up with what I remembered, it felt like something was leading us deeper on purpose. At first, I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were too strange to ignore. The trails we followed looped us back to places we'd already been, over and over again, almost like we were being guided in circles. Every time we thought we were heading back, we ended up even further from where we wanted to go. I started looking around, searching the trees for anything strange. Maybe a person or something that didn't belong. But the woods stayed quiet, too quiet. Felt like they were waiting. The sun set fully, and we had no choice but to stop. We were too tired to keep going, and the awful truth started to sink in. We might not find our way out of here. No matter how hard I tried to shake the thought, it wouldn't go away. We weren't just lost. We had been pulled into a trap. Something out here wanted us away from everything, hidden deep in these woods. We set up camp as the last light faded, but no one could sleep. Every sound, every branch snapping, every rustle in the bushes set my heart racing. Whatever had led us off the trail was still out there, watching us, waiting. I realized then we weren't the ones in charge anymore. Whoever or whatever had done this was in control now. When morning came, the forest felt even stranger. It was like it had shifted again during the night, changing into something even more unfamiliar. Trying to find our way back felt pointless now. It was clear that we were never going to get back the way we came. Whatever had brought us here had us exactly where it wanted us. And that's when I noticed it. Something new. Marks on the trees. Faint but there. Too organized to be natural. We weren't just lost in some random part of the woods. We had been led here. Trapped. I don't think it's going to let us go. I was hiking deep in the woods, far from any trail, just looking for a quiet spot to camp. The trees were thick, the kind of place where sunlight barely touches the ground. I felt completely alone. That was until I stumbled across an old campsite. It didn't look like someone had just packed up and left. It was strange. 2 tents were still standing, the flaps wide open. A cooler was knocked over, with cans and wrappers scattered on the ground. Clothes were thrown everywhere, like someone had emptied their bags in a panic. The whole thing felt off. It looked like whoever had been there left in a rush, but there was no sign of them anywhere. I stood there for a while, staring at the mess, trying to figure out what had happened. The food was still untouched, no animals had been through it. The clothes were just lying there, like people had run from something. But there were no footprints, no signs of a fight. It gave me a bad feeling, like whatever made them leave so fast could still be nearby, watching me. Even though it didn't feel right, I set up my camp about 100 feet away. The sun was going down, and I didn't want to hike any further. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a bear or bad weather scared them off. Still, I couldn't shake the nervous feeling in my stomach. Something about the place felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. As night came, the usual forest sounds started. Leaves rustling, an owl hooting in the distance. But then, I heard something else. At first, it was soft, like a whisper on the wind. A faint rustling, almost like footsteps. But they didn't sound steady. They would start, stop, then start again like someone or something was moving through the dark, trying to be quiet. I froze, listening closely. I kept telling myself it was just the wind or some animal passing by. But I didn't believe it. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I stayed awake in my tent, listening to every sound. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer. I held my breath, straining my ears to figure out where they were coming from. But it was too dark to see anything. My heart pounded in my chest when I heard it. A soft, slow breathing right outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The air felt thick, like something heavy was sitting on top of me. Then, the breathing stopped, but I didn't feel any better. Instead, I heard something else. It was a dragging sound, slow and steady, like something was being pulled through the dirt. The sound circled my camp, sometimes far away, sometimes close, always moving around just outside the reach of the firelight. The dragging sound went on for hours. Every time I thought it stopped, it would start up again, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter. I thought about getting up and running, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Fear kept me frozen inside the tent, hoping whatever was out there would go away. By morning, the noises were gone, and the usual forest sounds came back. I crawled out of the tent, my body stiff from being curled up all night. I looked around, expecting to see something. Footprints, a sign of whatever had been there. But there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of any animals. Just the quiet of the woods. I started packing up quickly, wanting to get out of there. But before I left, I took one last look at the abandoned campsite. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the trees, there was a fresh pile of dirt. It wasn't there before. It was a mound, like someone had been digging. My stomach twisted. Whatever had scared those campers, whatever had been dragging something around all night, wasn't gone. It had finished whatever it was doing. It had buried something or someone. As I stood there, staring at the mound of dirt, I felt it again. That same feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched. I didn't want to stick around to find out what was watching me. I grabbed my stuff and hiked out of there as fast as I could. But the feeling didn't go away. Even when I was miles from the campsite, I still felt it. Whatever had happened there, it wasn't over. I realized then that maybe the people who were there before me weren't just scared off by something. Maybe they didn't leave at all. And maybe whatever it was wasn't finished yet. It was just waiting for the next person to stumble across that campsite and stay the night. We set up camp in a spot far away from the main trails, deep in the woods. It seemed like the perfect place to get away for the weekend. Quiet, cut off, and far from everything. We spent the evening gathering wood, setting up our tents, and cooking over the fire. The sun went down fast, and soon the only light around us was from the fire, dancing against the trees. It was peaceful, mostly. Just the usual sounds of the forest, the crackle of the fire, the wind moving through the trees, and sometimes a faint sound of an animal in the distance. We were relaxed, just talking and hanging out, the kind of night where you don't worry about much. After a while, one of our friends got up and went into the woods, saying they needed a minute to relieve themselves. We didn't think much of it. The fire didn't light up much beyond where we sat, so it wasn't long before they disappeared into the darkness. We figured they'd be back in a few minutes, but time kept passing. It felt like a long time before someone realized how long they'd been gone. No one moved at first. Maybe they'd just gone a little farther than planned, we thought. But the minutes kept adding up, and soon we couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I grabbed a flashlight, and a couple of the others followed. We started looking into the trees, shining the light and calling out, hoping to see some sign of them. We spread out a little, keeping close enough to see each other, but every time we searched a new spot, we found nothing. The flashlight's beam didn't do much against the heavy dark, and after a while, it felt like the woods were swallowing everything, even our voices. We must have searched for hours. There were no tracks, no signs they'd been there, no sounds that pointed to anything strange. It was like they had just disappeared. The longer we searched, the quieter the woods became. It wasn't normal. That quiet made my skin crawl, like the forest itself was watching us. We ended up back at the fire, huddled together. Fear had settled in by then. We tried to come up with reasons. Maybe they had gotten turned around, maybe they walked too far, but nothing really made sense. The woods weren't that thick, and we hadn't walked that far from camp. Something else was going on. Something we didn't understand. The more time passed, the worse it got. A new thought kept creeping into my head, one I didn't want to say out loud. What if someone else was out there watching us? At first, it seemed stupid. We were in the middle of nowhere, far from any town or road. But the longer I sat there, the more it started to feel real. What if someone had been out there the whole time, just waiting? Tension built up between us. No one said much, but everyone was on edge. Every little sound felt wrong. The snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves. It all felt too close, like something was creeping toward us, just out of sight. My eyes kept darting to the trees, half expecting to see movement in the shadows beyond the firelight. It felt like something or someone could be out there, still watching, waiting for another chance. No one slept. We stayed by the fire, hoping it would keep us safe, but it didn't feel like enough. Every noise made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure that at any moment something would step out of the woods. The night felt like it would never end. By the time the sky started to lighten, we all agreed we had to leave. There was no point in staying. Whatever had happened to our friend wasn't something we could figure out here. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the trees. I kept scanning the edges of the woods, waiting to see movement, waiting to see something come out and show itself. But nothing ever did. The woods stayed quiet, too quiet. We left, walking back to the trail, but it felt wrong leaving without our friend. There were no answers, just a sick feeling in my gut that wouldn't go away. I wondered if we were leaving something behind, something worse than just a missing person. As we walked, I glanced back one last time. The trees stood still, as if they'd swallowed the truth. And for a moment, I thought I saw movement just beyond the edge of the path. Something or someone blending into the dark. We never found our friend. But I know deep down we weren't alone in those woods. And whatever was out there, it's still waiting. It was meant to be a fun weekend camping trip with my dad and his old friend, Sergeant Miller. We set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. The sun was going down, casting long shadows between the trees, and the air smelled like pine, mixed with the sound of crickets chirping. I felt excited and ready for the adventure ahead. After we put up our tents, my dad and Sergeant Miller started a fire. They laughed and shared stories from their time in the military while I roasted marshmallows over the flames. As it got darker, the forest filled with sounds. The crackling fire and the rustling leaves felt comforting. But there was something in the air that made me feel uneasy. Later that night, while the adults were still talking, I decided to explore the area a bit. I crept quietly into the trees, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The forest was thick, and as I wandered deeper, I noticed how quiet it had become. The sounds from our camp faded away, swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, I came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked out of place, like it had been there forever, forgotten and left to decay. The door hung crookedly on its hinges. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The wooden floor creaked under my feet as I pushed the door open, revealing a dusty inside filled with broken furniture and scattered debris. As I looked around, I noticed something odd. The floorboards had deep scratches, and the walls were marked with strange symbols. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I quickly left the cabin and rushed back to camp, my heart racing. When I got back, I saw my dad and Sergeant Miller were quiet, their faces serious. I asked what was wrong, and my dad said he'd seen something moving in the woods nearby. It was then I realized I wasn't the only one feeling on edge. The fire flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch closer, as if they were alive. That night, after crawling into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wind rustled the trees outside, and every little sound made me jump. Finally, I fell asleep, only to be jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart raced as I sat up, trying to figure out what was going on. I crawled out of my tent and found Sergeant Miller standing by the fire, staring into the dark. He pointed toward the trees. I squinted, and my stomach dropped. There, in the shadows, was a figure, tall, with a dark shape that seemed to shift in and out of view. Panic surged through me, and I backed away. But before I could say anything, Sergeant Miller rushed to grab a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but whatever was there had disappeared. My dad joined us, his face pale, and he told us to stay close. As we sat around the fire, tension filled the air. We watched closely, waiting for something to happen, but the night dragged on in eerie silence. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows, and I could feel the fear in my chest growing stronger. Eventually, the night faded into dawn, but it felt like we had just survived something terrifying. When the sun finally rose, we hurried to pack up our things. I felt a strange sense of relief as we left that campsite behind, but the memory of that figure stuck with me. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest. It looked peaceful and calm, but I knew there was something hidden in those woods, something that was watching us, waiting for the right moment. I didn't tell my dad or Sergeant Miller about the cabin or the figure. Some things are better left unsaid, especially in deep, dark woods where not everything is what it seems. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those trees was still out there, lingering in the shadows, ready to strike when we least expected it. I would never forget that trip. The woods felt alive, and I knew they were hiding secrets, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far into their depths. Last summer, my grandparents decided to take me camping in a quiet place deep in the woods. I was really excited. I had spent many weekends with them before, but this time felt different. We loaded up their old camper and drove for hours, finally reaching a hidden campsite surrounded by tall trees and a peaceful lake. On the first night, we set up our camp and built a small fire. The crackling flames lit up their faces, and the warmth was comforting against the cool night air. After roasting marshmallows, my grandfather shared stories from his younger days. I felt safe and happy, surrounded by the sounds of nature. As the days went by, I started to notice some strange things. At night, I kept hearing noises in the bushes, and shadows seemed to dance just beyond the light of our fire. My grandparents brushed it off as wild animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The woods felt alive in a way that made me uneasy, especially when the sun set and everything turned dark. One evening, after a long day of hiking, my grandparents went to bed early. I stayed up, wanting to enjoy the calmness of the night. As the fire burned low, the rustling from the trees behind our campsite got louder. Curiosity pulled me to check it out, hoping to see what was making the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped away from the camper, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. The light cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and shadows. I called out softly, hoping to scare away whatever it was. But there was no response, only silence. Suddenly, I heard a loud snap of a branch behind me. I turned quickly, my flashlight flickering across the area, but I didn't see anything. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I should go back to the camper, but my curiosity got the better of me. I took a few more steps into the darkness, shining my light ahead. That's when I saw it, a figure partly hidden among the trees. It looked human but was too still and quiet. I froze, my heart racing. Thoughts flooded my mind. Was it a lost hiker or something much worse? I turned to run, but before I could move, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground, dropping my flashlight. The light spun wildly, lighting up the forest for just a second. In that brief moment, I saw the figure moving closer, and my breath caught in my throat. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my flashlight, and dashed toward the camper. I threw open the door and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My heart raced as I listened for any signs of the figure outside, but all I heard was the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I sat in the dark, shaking, until I heard my grandparents stirring. They woke up, and I quickly told them what happened. My grandfather looked out the window but saw nothing. They told me it was probably just an animal, but I could see they were a little rattled too. The next morning, we hurried to pack up. I felt the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me as we drove away. I looked back at the woods, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. I didn't know what I had encountered that night, but I knew it would stay with me forever. Sometimes the woods keep secrets, and not everything is what it seems. As we drove down the winding road, a feeling of dread hung in the air. The camping trip was over, but the sense of being watched lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. When I glanced back one last time, expecting to see that figure watching us leave, my stomach dropped. All I could see were the tall trees standing silent and still, but I could feel something was off. I realized that whatever it was, it hadn't just disappeared. It was still out there, hidden among the trees, waiting. That's when I understood. Some places are not meant for us, and some things in the woods are better left alone. As we drove away, the feeling of unease settled in my chest like a heavy stone, knowing that the woods would always remember me, and if I ever returned, I might not be alone again. We decided to camp in the old graveyard just outside of town. My cousin thought it was funny, but the place always gave me a bad feeling. I'd heard stories growing up about weird things happening there. Not ghosts or anything like that, just kids getting lost or people seeing strange lights. It seemed harmless enough though, and we weren't really the type to believe in superstitions. The sun had just gone down, and the sky turned dark purple as we set up our tent. The graveyard was quiet, with tall grass and weeds everywhere. The headstones were really old, some cracked and covered in moss, others so worn you couldn't read the names on them. We didn't set up too close to the graves because that felt wrong. The night passed without much happening. We made some food, talked a little, and soon it got cold fast. It was colder than I thought it would be for fall. A thick fog started rolling in, covering the ground and wrapping around the headstones. I could hear the wind blowing through the trees in the distance, but it was otherwise dead silent. I kept looking over at the graves, feeling like something wasn't right. I tried to brush it off. There was nothing there, just the mist and the old gravestones. That night I couldn't sleep. My cousin was out cold, snoring next to me, but I lay there, staring up at the tent's roof, listening. Every little sound seemed louder, and the fog outside made the air feel heavy. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, soft but steady, walking around our tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps were too slow, too heavy. It sounded like a person. I froze, holding my breath, trying to hear better. The steps got closer, then stopped right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. There were no lights out here, no trails, and no reason for anyone to be wandering around the graveyard in the middle of the night. I kept telling myself it had to be my mind playing tricks, maybe just the wind. Then I heard something brush against the tent, like fingers dragging along the fabric. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it toward the side of the tent. The light bounced off the fabric, showing nothing but my cousin still fast asleep. But the sound didn't stop. It started again, walking around the tent slowly, like someone was circling us. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I listened. I didn't dare move. After what felt like hours, the steps faded away into the fog. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't come back. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of birds and light streaming into the tent. My cousin was already up, packing our stuff. He didn't say much, just asked if I slept okay. I didn't mention what I'd heard. Maybe it was nothing, just my mind messing with me. Maybe it was just a normal night. We packed up and started walking back to the car. As we passed one of the older graves, something caught my eye. Footprints. Fresh ones. They led from the area around our tent, winding between the headstones and disappearing into the woods at the far end of the graveyard. They were deep, clear, and shaped like someone's shoes. They weren't there the night before. I didn't say anything. We got into the car and I drove us home. But the whole ride back, I couldn't shake this feeling, like the footsteps hadn't stayed behind. Like whatever had been walking around our tent hadn't left when we did. I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it was just some stranger wandering through the graveyard. But then I started noticing something strange. A few days after we got back, I'd hear noises outside my house at night, footsteps on the porch, creaks on the stairs. At first, I thought it was animals, but the pattern was too familiar. The same slow, heavy steps I'd heard in the graveyard. Last night, I woke up to the sound of those footsteps again, this time inside my house. They stopped right outside my bedroom door, and I lay there, frozen, just like I had been in that tent. Whatever it was, it's not just out there in the graveyard. It's closer now, watching, waiting, and I'm not sure it's ever going to leave. It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up. I was out camping, this time alone, with my tent set up deep in the woods. The weather report said there would only be light rain, but by the time night hit, it was pouring. My tent wasn't exactly the best, and soon enough, I could feel water sneaking in from the edges. The sound of the rain hitting the tent was loud and constant, almost putting me to sleep. Inside the tent, the air felt heavy. I could smell the wet dirt underneath me, mixing with the rain outside. I lay back, listening to the rain, but there was this weird feeling I couldn't shake. Something just felt off. Maybe it was because I was alone, far from everything, or maybe it was the way the wind started to blow harder, making the trees creak and sway. I had been out in the woods many times before, but tonight felt different. Every little noise outside seemed louder than normal. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer walking around or raccoons looking for food. But every now and then, it felt like something or someone was right outside the tent, waiting. You know that feeling you get when you're being watched? That's exactly how it felt. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like footsteps moving on the wet ground. It didn't sound like rain or wind. It was slow on purpose. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I froze, my heart beating so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound got closer, then stopped right next to my tent. I held my breath, not daring to move. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I unzip the tent? Stay quiet? I couldn't even make myself move. The footsteps moved away, slowly at first, then fading completely into the rain. But I didn't relax. I knew better than to think it was over. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe something curious passing by. But then there was a new sound, a soft scratching right next to where I was laying. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the scratching followed along the side of the tent, slow and steady. I didn't want to look, but I felt like I had to. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent just a little bit, and shined the light outside. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of anything. I stared out into the dark, the rain coming down harder now, but nothing moved. No sound except for the rain and wind. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, trying to settle down. But as soon as I did, the scratching started again. This time it was louder, closer. It moved along the side of the tent, right where I had just checked. I tried to stay calm, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The scratching was deliberate, and it didn't stop. It followed the entire length of the tent, back and forth like it was testing the material, seeing how far it could go. My flashlight flickered, and the rain outside seemed to grow heavier, drowning out everything else. Then, all at once, it stopped. I lay there, straining to hear any sign of movement, but the silence felt worse. It was like everything outside had gone still, waiting. I didn't know what to do, but as I lay there in the dark, a thought crossed my mind that chilled me to the core. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't an animal. Animals get scared off. But this thing, it wasn't afraid. It knew I was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Hours later, when the rain finally stopped, I stepped outside the tent, hoping for some relief. The ground was soaked, mud sticking to my shoes. But what stopped me in my tracks was the line of scratches all around the tent, deep, clawed marks running from one end to the other. I wasn't alone that night. And whatever had been there, it was still out there somewhere, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet camping trip in the mountains. My husband and I had been talking about it for months, excited to just get away from everything and enjoy some peace. We picked a far-off spot with a nice view, put up our tent, and felt a calm settle over us. The first day went great, just the two of us, surrounded by trees and open air. Then the weather changed. The sky started turning dark, and I could hear thunder in the distance. We had checked the weather before we left, and there was no talk of rain. But there it was, moving in fast. We hurried to grab all our stuff, barely pulling the last of it into the tent before the rain started. At first, it was just a light shower, but it quickly turned into heavy rain. We decided to wait it out in the tent. The rain beat down hard on the tent, sounding like fingers tapping all over it. The mountain that had felt so peaceful earlier now seemed like it was closing in on us. The wind started blowing stronger, making the tent shake. I could feel the ground getting muddy under us as the rain kept soaking everything. Night came, but the rain didn't stop. It got colder, and the tent started leaking in places, making everything feel wet and uncomfortable. The air was thick, and it was hard to relax. I tried to fall asleep, but I kept hearing something else, something that wasn't the rain. At first, I thought it was the wind, but after a while, I realized it wasn't. It was a noise, quiet but clear, like someone walking on the wet ground right outside the tent. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something walking nearby, but the steps were slow and steady, circling the tent. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It was too calm, too steady, like someone was walking around, taking their time. I stayed completely still, listening as the steps moved around us again and again. They were close, so close that at one point, I could almost hear breathing. I didn't move. My husband was sleeping beside me, completely unaware. I didn't want to wake him. I didn't even know what to say or what we could do. We were out in the middle of nowhere, no phone signal, and there was no way anyone else was out here. The steps kept going, and I just lay there, my heart racing. The rain finally slowed down, but the footsteps didn't. Whoever or whatever it was, they were still there, walking around the tent, watching. Every now and then, the steps would stop, and I'd only hear the rain dripping. Then they'd start again, always circling, always there. When morning came, the rain stopped. Everything was too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. We got out of the tent, and the air was cold. The ground was soaked, but something else caught my eye. Just outside the tent in the mud were footprints, deep footprints. They weren't ours. They circled the tent, going around and around, clear in the mud. Someone had been there, walking while we slept, watching us. We packed up as fast as we could and left, barely talking, just wanting to get away. On the way down the mountain, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, about how close someone had been, about how they never tried to come in or speak, just kept watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, somewhere in the trees, following us. Even now, back home, whenever it rains, I remember that night. The sound of the rain brings it all back. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I hear the rain outside my window, I check to see if someone's there, watching again. And one day I feel like they will be. Maybe not in the mountains, but closer. I was part of a team sent to track down a dangerous criminal who had been hiding in the woods. He'd been on the run for weeks, and the last information we had said he was camping deep in the forest. We had no backup, just us and the trees. We had a rough idea where he might be, but the forest was huge. He could be anywhere. We started early in the morning. The trees were tall, and the air smelled strong like pine. As we moved deeper into the woods, the ground became rough. Rocks and fallen branches made it harder to walk. We split into smaller groups, keeping our radios low so we wouldn't be heard. The goal was to cover as much of the area as we could without giving away our positions. The further I walked, the more alone I felt. The forest was quiet, but not in a way that felt peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, like everything around you is watching. Every little sound, like the snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves, made my heart race. Could be him. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement, but the trees were so thick, and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. After hours of walking, I found a small clearing. It wasn't on our map, and I didn't see anyone around, but something felt off. The ground was messed up, the grass flattened like someone had been through here recently. I knelt down to check for footprints. I found them faint, but clear enough to show someone had passed by. I followed the trail carefully. The more I followed, the clearer it became that whoever had been here was in a hurry. Broken branches and scuffed rocks showed they weren't just walking. They were moving fast. I picked up my pace but tried to stay quiet. That's when I saw it. A small campsite hidden between the trees. The tent was old, with holes in it, and the fire pit still had some smoke coming from it. It hadn't been cold for long. My heart pounded as I moved closer, trying to stay low. The air was still, no sounds at all. I crouched behind a tree, listening, waiting. It was too quiet. Then I saw him, just for a second, a figure moving through the trees about 50 feet away. He hadn't seen me. I kept low and crept closer. He was walking quickly, like he knew someone was after him. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and he kept glancing around like he was nervous. I followed him, staying back. Every step felt heavier as the situation sunk in. This wasn't just some easy arrest. He was desperate, and desperate people don't think straight. I watched him disappear behind a thick patch of trees. That's when I decided to make my move. I crept around to the side, trying to stay hidden. But when I got to where I had last seen him, he was gone. I scanned the area, but it was like the forest swallowed him. A cold feeling ran down my back, like I was the one being watched now. Something wasn't right. I stayed low, looking around carefully. That's when I noticed something strange. A shallow hole in the ground, covered with leaves and branches, not far from where I lost sight of him. It wasn't natural. Someone had dug it. I knew I should move on, but my gut told me I had to check it out. I brushed the leaves aside and found a small pit. Inside, there was a stash of supplies, water, some food, and a set of clothes. Next to them, half buried in the dirt, was a small handgun. This was his backup plan. If things went wrong, this is where he would come to hide. Just as I started to put it all together, I heard movement again, much closer this time. I froze, realizing I'd let my guard down. The hairs on my neck stood up. He was nearby, and he knew I was here. My breathing sped up as my eyes scanned the trees. The forest felt like it was closing in on me. Then I saw him, only 10 feet away, standing between two large trees, staring right at me. I don't know how long he had been watching me, but there was no more running in his eyes. I reached for my radio, but before I could do anything, I noticed something even worse. Behind him, just barely visible in the shadows, were more figures. Silent, standing still. My heart dropped as it hit me. He wasn't hiding alone. We weren't hunting just one man. They'd been waiting for us the whole time. We had been planning the camping trip for weeks, me, my sister, and her husband. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any regular campsites. We wanted to experience the wild for real. I'd never been that deep into the forest before, but my sister's husband promised us he knew the area well. He grew up nearby and had been camping there since he was a kid. The first few days were fine, quiet, peaceful even. We spent our days hiking and sitting around the fire at night. Everything seemed normal until the third night, when things started to feel off. It began with noises. At first, they were just small sounds like branches snapping in the distance. I thought it was probably just animals moving around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My sister noticed it too, but her husband stayed relaxed, like he didn't hear a thing. He always seemed calm, no matter what. That night, we went to bed early. As I lay in my tent, I could hear the forest outside getting louder, like something was moving around us. It wasn't just small animals. There was something bigger out there, moving slowly, like it was watching us. It felt like whatever it was, it kept circling our campsite. Later in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, steady, and right outside my tent. I held my breath and listened carefully. The footsteps stopped right at the entrance of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, hoping it would go away. After what felt like forever, the steps moved on, but I stayed still, too scared to open my tent and see what it was. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all. When I finally crawled out of my tent, my sister and her husband were already up, acting like nothing was wrong. I decided not to mention the footsteps. Maybe I imagined it. Later that day, we went for another hike. As usual, my sister's husband took the lead, guiding us deeper into the woods. Something about the way he walked made me uneasy this time. He wasn't just leading the way. He was looking around, scanning the trees like he was waiting for something or looking for something. It felt off. We stopped at a clearing to rest. My sister went off to gather some firewood, leaving me alone with her husband. I tried to act normal, but then I noticed something in his face. He wasn't calm anymore. His eyes were focused, tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. It made me feel uneasy, more than I wanted to admit. That's when it clicked. He knew these woods too well for it to feel right. I started piecing things together, how calm he was during the weird noises, the footsteps, and now the way he led us deeper and deeper into the forest. He wasn't just leading us on a hike. He was taking us somewhere I didn't want to go. I kept my thoughts to myself, watching him closely as we made our way back to the campsite. My nerves were on edge, and every snap of a twig made me jump. When we got back, my sister went to the nearby stream to fill our water bottles. I didn't waste a second. I quickly grabbed my gear, packed everything, and waited for her to come back. I had to get out of there. Whatever was going on, I wasn't sticking around to find out. When my sister returned, I made up an excuse about needing to leave early. Her husband didn't argue, but the look he gave me made my skin crawl. It was like he knew I had figured something out, and it didn't bother him at all. He just stared at me with this cold, knowing look, like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. We hiked back to the car in silence, the feeling of being watched following me the whole way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen if I stayed any longer. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip, the way her husband acted, the strange noises, the footsteps. It all played over and over in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her husband had led us deep into the woods on purpose. He knew where he was taking us, and I think he was waiting for something. I don't know what it was, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I haven't gone camping with them since. There's something about him that changed out there, something he's not showing. I don't know what he's planning, but I know one thing for sure. I was never supposed to make it out of those woods. It was late October, and I decided to spend a few days camping in the woods near my hometown. The leaves were changing into bright colors, and the air felt nice and cool, making it a great time for camping. I set up my tent in a small clearing not far from a lake. It was peaceful, with just the sounds of nature around me. As a retired police officer, I had spent many years in the city, handling crime and chaos. This trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to relax and enjoy the quiet of the forest. I felt sure I could handle anything that came my way, even at 65 years old. The first night went by without a hitch. I built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and watched the stars fill the sky. I could see a few other campers across the lake, their laughter mixing with the soft sounds of leaves rustling in the breeze. It felt nice to be out there, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life. But the second night changed everything. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a strange sound, like branches snapping. At first, I thought it might be a deer or another animal, but then I heard it again, and it was closer this time. It was unsettling. I decided to check it out. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, looking around at the dark trees. The light cut through the darkness but only showed shadows. Just as I was about to head back inside, I saw something moving between the trees. It looked like a person, but something didn't feel right. They were too still and too quiet. My old instincts kicked in, and I felt a familiar tension. I called out to see if anyone needed help, but got no answer, just silence. My heart raced as I slowly moved toward where I'd seen the figure. The sound of my footsteps felt too loud in the stillness of the night. As I got closer, I could see more clearly. It wasn't just one person. There were several figures standing near a tree. They were dressed in dark clothes, and I couldn't see their faces. Panic began to creep in. My years of training told me this wasn't a good situation. I turned to go back to my tent when I realized one of them had spotted me. A figure stepped forward, moving quickly and deliberately. I knew I had to act fast. I rushed back to my tent, grabbing my phone and a heavy flashlight. I wasn't about to let fear take over. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what was happening. They promised to send someone right away, but waiting felt like forever. I sat inside my tent, heart pounding, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. The fire had died down, leaving everything in darkness. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound. It was close. I aimed my flashlight at the entrance of the tent, ready to defend myself. The shadowy figure from before stepped into the beam of light. It wasn't one of the campers from across the lake. It was a strange man with wild eyes, looking more like a threat than a lost camper. Before I could react, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't relax just yet. The man slowly backed away, seeming to realize he was no longer in control. He turned and ran into the woods, disappearing into the dark. A few moments later, the police arrived, lights flashing and voices calling out. I scrambled out of my tent, yelling for them. They quickly secured the area and searched for the man, but he was long gone. After a thorough investigation, the officers confirmed that several similar incidents had been reported in the area recently. They warned me to pack up and leave as soon as possible. As I took down my camp, I felt shaken but also thankful to be alive. I had come to enjoy the peaceful woods, but instead, I'd faced a very real danger. It was a harsh reminder that while nature can be beautiful, it can also hide serious threats. Once everything was packed, I climbed into my truck, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The drive home felt different, as if the shadows of the trees were watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, lurking in the dark. As I pulled away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone standing there, but instead, I saw nothing but trees. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. I might have left the woods, but the woods hadn't left me. The thrill of that encounter would stay with me for a long time, a chilling reminder that some dangers never truly go away, especially when they know where to find you. I had always enjoyed camping in the woods, finding comfort in the sound of leaves rustling and the crackling of the campfire. This time, I was by myself, wanting some quiet time away from the noise of daily life. I drove deep into the forest until I found a hidden spot by a lake, surrounded by tall pine trees. Felt perfect. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and cooked some dinner as the sun sank below the horizon. As night fell, the woods changed. The crickets chirped and owls hooted. But there was something else, something unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. Around midnight, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the dark. The beam of light danced over the trees, revealing shadows that shifted just out of view. I could hear the usual nighttime sounds, the wind, the animals, but there was an odd silence deeper in the woods, as if everything had stopped to watch me. As I walked, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin hidden behind some bushes. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was rotting and the windows were broken. My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. A chill ran down my back. I felt a strong urge to leave, but then I saw something shiny on the floor. It was a small metal box. I bent down to pick it up, and as I opened it, a terrible smell hit me. Inside were old photographs, faces worn and faded. I realized they were missing persons reports, people who had disappeared in these woods over the years. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft crunching sound. My heart raced as I turned, shining my flashlight into the dark. Nothing was there, but the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. I quickly shoved the box back into my bag and turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get out. As I made my way back to my campsite, I felt like something was following me. The rustling leaves seemed closer, the shadows darker. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I finally reached my tent, zipped it shut, and grabbed my knife for comfort in the heavy silence. I lay still in the dark, trying to control my breathing. Hours passed, but sleep wouldn't come. The woods were quiet now, too quiet. Just when I thought it was all in my head, a loud thud against my tent jolted me upright. I held my breath, straining to listen. The thud came again, followed by a soft scratching noise. My heart raced as I remembered the box and the faces in the photographs. In a panic, I decided I had to leave. I gathered my things as quietly as I could, my hands shaking. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the area. The woods looked different in the dark. Every shadow seemed to loom closer, almost alive. The scratching sound continued, now mixed with a low growl that made my skin crawl. I sprinted to my car, fumbling to unlock the door. I tossed my bag inside and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. A dark figure stood just outside the reach of my light, watching me closely, its shape twisted and unnatural. I peeled out of the campsite, not daring to look back. The adrenaline coursed through me as I drove fast down the dirt road, desperate to escape. The woods seemed to close in on me from either side, the trees leaning closer, almost as if they were reaching for my car. I felt relief only when I reached the main road, the safety of civilization finally in sight. But even as I drove away, a chilling thought settled in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked. I thought about those missing persons, the photos in the box, and how easily I could have become one of them. When I finally got home, the feeling of dread still lingered. Every little noise made me jump. I felt like something was still with me. I avoided camping for a long time, but the memories haunted me. I could still picture that dark figure standing in the woods, watching. Felt like a warning. Some places in the forest are not meant for people, I realized, and some secrets are buried for a reason. Months later, I found myself driving past those woods again, almost against my will. I couldn't help but look at the entrance, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding, and in that moment, I understood. The forest had not forgotten me. It was waiting, and it always would be. The thought that I could be drawn back there made me shiver. I never felt safe again, always wondering what was lurking just beyond the edge of the light, ready to claim the next lost soul. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My husband and I had planned this camping trip for months, hoping to get away from the city and just relax in the woods. We found a spot deep in the forest, far from the main paths, where no one would bother us. We set up our tent, and everything seemed perfect. It started raining while we were finishing dinner. At first, it was just a light rain, but soon it turned into heavy rain. The sound of it hitting the tarp over our tent was kind of soothing at first. As it got darker, the woods around us seemed to close in, and the rain was all I could hear. The trees moved with the wind, and the whole place felt off. My husband and I were used to camping, but something about that night felt wrong. It was like the rain was hiding something, a weird kind of quiet that didn't feel right. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The rain just kept going, non-stop, and the wind was loud through the trees. My husband fell asleep fast, tired from our long hike. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really alone out there. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside the tent, a small noise under the rain. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but it didn't help me feel any better. The night dragged on, and the rain never stopped. My nerves were on edge. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, when I heard it again, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on the wet ground, close to the tent. My heart started racing. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping I was just imagining it. But then I heard it again, louder, closer. I reached over and gently nudged my husband, but he didn't wake up. I thought about waking him, but I didn't want to freak out for no reason. Maybe it was nothing, but the next sound changed everything. A long, slow scrape against the side of the tent. I froze. My mind raced. It wasn't an animal. It was slow, careful, like someone was feeling their way around the tent. My stomach tightened with fear. I felt trapped, like the thin fabric of the tent wasn't enough to keep us safe from whatever was outside. The scraping stopped. For a few seconds, everything went quiet, except for the rain. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for the next noise. Then, without warning, the tent shook hard, like something had thrown itself against it. My husband jerked awake, startled. He didn't need to ask what was going on. He heard it too. We both stayed completely still, not even daring to move, waiting for whatever was outside to make another move. But it didn't. Instead, we heard slow, heavy footsteps. They moved away from the tent, getting quieter as they disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the sound of the rain. We didn't move for what felt like hours, too scared to breathe, too scared to even think about what had just happened. When the rain finally slowed down near dawn, we didn't waste any time. We packed up as fast as we could, leaving most of our gear behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. We never talked about that night, but the fear lingered. We both knew it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't lost either. Whoever or whatever was out there, it knew exactly where we were. And that thought is what still keeps me up at night, because I know whatever it was just watching us, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling it'll find us again. I was heading to the Ukraine border for a solo camping trip, not far from a small village. The plan was simple: spend the night out in the open, get a sense of the place, then move on the next morning. I had my small tent, some food, and the basics. The spot I picked was quiet, surrounded by trees with a stream nearby. It felt out of the way, which is exactly what I wanted, just me and nature. As the sun started going down, I set up camp. Once it got dark, everything went still. There was no wind, no animals, not even the sound of bugs. It was like the whole place just stopped moving. I told myself I was imagining things, but the quiet was different, like it was too quiet. It made my skin crawl. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there staring up at the fabric ceiling. Every sound felt louder than it should. The grass under my tent crunched when I moved, and the water in the stream seemed too loud, like it was echoing. I started to get the feeling I wasn't alone. Felt like someone was out there watching, but I hadn't seen a single person all day. After a while, I heard something strange. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some animal, but these steps were too slow, too steady, like they were being careful. They got closer and stopped right outside my tent. I froze. My heart started pounding, and I tried not to breathe too loud. Who would be out here this late? No one knew I was camping here. I felt a shadow pass over the tent, blocking the little moonlight that was shining through. I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would go away. The footsteps started again, circling my tent like they were checking me out, like they were deciding something. I felt trapped, surrounded by nothing but thin fabric. Then, just as quickly as it started, the footsteps stopped. I lay there, not moving, waiting for what felt like forever. I slowly unzipped the tent just a little and peeked outside. There was nothing. No one was there. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe being alone out here was getting to me. But when I looked closer, I saw footprints in the dirt. They led from the trees right to my tent. Someone had definitely been there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. That's when I saw it. Something moving just beyond the light, slipping back into the shadows. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not bothering to fold anything properly. I just needed to move. As I started walking back toward the village, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I could feel eyes on me, and every now and then, I heard faint footsteps behind me. Someone was following me, but they stayed just far enough back that I couldn't see them. The trail was rough, and I tripped more than once, but I kept going. I didn't want to stop. The footsteps behind me kept pace, like they were keeping just close enough to let me know they were still there. Every time I thought I lost them, I'd hear that same slow, steady crunch of leaves. By the time I reached the village, the sky was starting to get light. I didn't stop until I was in the middle of the village, surrounded by houses and people. I finally turned around, and the path behind me was empty. Whatever had been following me was gone. I never went camping near the border again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that feeling of being watched, of hearing footsteps just out of sight. And I wonder, whoever was out there that night, did they just stop following me? Or are they still out there, watching, waiting for the next person to come along? Maybe they're not done yet. Maybe it wasn't a random encounter. Maybe they were waiting for someone like me all along. I've been camping in the woods for years. Nothing ever made me worry. I liked how quiet it was, especially now that I'm 76. The silence out here calms me. It's nice to be away from everything, just me and the trees. This trip wasn't any different. I set up my tent by a small stream, unpacked my stuff, and got ready to enjoy a few peaceful days. The first day went fine. I cooked some food over the fire, sat by the water, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. It was a bit colder than usual, but I didn't mind. I had enough layers on, and the fire was warm. The forest got quiet, like it always did at night. You get used to it. It's kind of relaxing. I fell asleep quickly, feeling comfortable in my tent. The next morning, though, something felt off. The firewood I'd gathered was all over the place, not where I left it. I thought maybe an animal came by during the night, but there weren't any tracks. I tried not to think too much of it and went on with my day. But as the hours went by, little things started to stand out. My gear wasn't exactly where I left it. Nothing big, just small things that made me wonder if I was getting forgetful. I told myself I was just getting older, that maybe I wasn't remembering things right. But deep down, something felt wrong. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I kept looking at the trees. It didn't feel the same. The woods were quiet, but it wasn't the normal kind of quiet. Felt like something was off, like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head. But every little noise, every rustle in the leaves, made me tense up. My eyes kept darting to the shadows. When it got dark, I went to my tent earlier than usual. I thought if I could just sleep, maybe the feeling would go away. But it didn't. I lay there wide awake, listening. The wind had stopped, and the forest was dead silent. That's when I heard it. Soft movement outside the tent. Barely there, but enough to make me freeze. My heart was pounding and I didn't move. Then I heard it, slow footsteps, crunching on the leaves around my campsite. I stayed completely still, not even breathing, just listening. The steps got closer, slow and steady, like someone was taking their time. They circled my tent, and then I heard them go through my stuff. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an animal. This was a person. The footsteps stopped right at the tent entrance. I waited, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Then I heard the zipper. Slowly, it started to open. I sat up, grabbing the knife I kept near me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, and nothing came out. The zipper stopped halfway. I sat there, knife in hand, waiting for something to reach inside. But nothing happened. The seconds dragged on. Then, just like that, the footsteps started up again, walking away from the tent, slow and steady, disappearing into the woods. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The silence in the woods was crushing. I kept the knife close, too scared to even blink. When the first light came, I packed up everything as fast as I could and got out of there. I didn't look back. I didn't try to figure out who or what was out there. All I knew was that I wasn't alone. Something or someone had been watching me that night, walking around my camp, and it wasn't an animal. I haven't been back to those woods since. Every time I think about it, I remember the sound of those slow footsteps, how close they came, how they almost got inside my tent. There are people out there, people who hide in the woods, waiting for someone to stumble into their space. I don't know what they wanted that night, but I know this much. I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. And the thought that they're still out there, waiting for the next camper, still sends a chill down my spine. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks. My business partner, his sister, and his wife were all looking forward to spending a few nights in the woods. I'm not really into camping, but I figured it would be a good break from work. The drive was long, and as we kept going, the more cut off we felt from everything. By the time we got there, it was just us and miles of thick forest. The first night went fine. We set up our tents, had dinner, and sat around talking until it got late. But there was something about the silence that didn't sit right with me. No animals, no wind, just stillness. When it was time to sleep, I lay in my tent, trying to hear anything, but it was dead quiet. The next morning, I took a short walk to clear my head. That's when I noticed a few weird things. Some branches were snapped clean off, like someone had broken them on purpose. And there were deep footprints in the dirt, but they weren't from any animal I knew. I told myself it was just other campers, probably from nearby, and brushed it off. No one else seemed to care when I brought it up. That evening, things felt different. The air felt heavy, and once again, it was too quiet. My partner's wife went off to grab some more firewood, and his sister stayed around the camp. I watched the tree line as it started getting dark, and a bad feeling settled over me. My partner had gone down to the lake, so I stuck around to keep watch. A few minutes passed, then a few more. I kept looking around, waiting for her to come back with the wood, but she was gone longer than I thought she should be. I was just about to go after her when she walked out of the trees, empty-handed. She looked pale, like she'd seen something. She didn't speak, just sat down by the tent and stared off at nothing. We didn't ask her about it. After a while, I tried to push it out of my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy again, and there was this pressure that I couldn't explain. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, right outside my tent. I froze, my heart racing, trying to stay as still as possible. The footsteps circled the tent, getting closer, then stopped right outside. I didn't move a muscle. It felt like hours passed before the steps started up again, moving back toward the woods. I sat up, trying to figure out what it was, but I didn't have the nerve to look. The next morning, I mentioned it to the group, but no one had heard anything. I started to feel like I was going crazy, like the woods were messing with me. On the last night, everything felt worse. We sat around the fire, but no one was really talking. My partner's wife kept staring at the trees, like she was waiting for something. His sister seemed jumpy, and my partner sat there rubbing his hands together like he was nervous. It wasn't like him at all. I was starting to panic inside. I wanted to leave, but something told me we shouldn't. As we sat there, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Just at the edge of the firelight, in the trees, there was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, blending in with the shadows. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but it was still there. I looked around at the others, but no one else seemed to see it. A cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just watched. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. The next morning, we packed up early, cutting the trip short. No one talked about what had happened, and I didn't bring up what I saw. I knew they wouldn't believe me. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us the whole time. Something we weren't supposed to see. A week after we got back, I got a call from my business partner. He sounded off like he hadn't slept in days. He told me his wife had been acting strange, staring out their window at night, whispering that she could still see the trees. He didn't come into work after that. I didn't want to think about it, but now, every night, I keep hearing those footsteps outside my window, slow, heavy, and getting closer. And when I look outside, I swear I can still see that figure, just standing there, waiting. I set up my tent just as the rain started to fall. The thick jungle around me came alive with the sound of raindrops hitting the leaves, and I could hear insects buzzing faintly in the distance. I had found a small open spot in the rainforest of South America just before it got dark. The area was far from any roads or villages, exactly the kind of place I had been searching for. It felt quiet, peaceful, and for the first few hours, I thought I was lucky to have found it. As the rain got heavier, I stayed dry inside my tent. The constant patter of the rain hitting the tent became a soft, steady sound that made me sleepy. But then something shifted. Over the noise of the rain, I began to hear something else. At first, it was barely there, mixing with the rain, but the more I listened, the more I noticed it. It was a low, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the wet ground. I told myself it was probably just an animal. The jungle was full of them, and they lived here, not me. But the sound didn't move away. It stayed right outside the tent. Every time I thought it stopped, it started again, dragging through the mud just outside the thin walls of my tent. My stomach tightened with a sense of dread. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to shine the light outside. The beam cut through the rain and darkness, but I couldn't see anything strange. Just trees, thick vines, and shadows moving in the rain. The noise had stopped. I quickly zipped the tent back up, trying to calm myself down. But no matter what I told myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't really alone out here. I lay back down, but sleep never came. The rain grew even heavier, and the usual sounds of the jungle faded away. But that scraping noise returned. This time, it was louder and closer, as if something was circling my tent. It was slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. I tried to think of what it could be. There was no way it was a person. Nobody should be out here. I was miles away from any trail, and it was the middle of the night. But animals don't drag things in circles like that. Whatever was out there, it wasn't acting like any animal I'd ever heard of. The noise kept getting louder, and then it was right next to the tent. Only the thin fabric separated me from whatever was on the other side. I froze, barely breathing, listening to the sound as it moved along the tent's side, as if it was feeling out the material, testing it. I stared at the walls of the tent, expecting to see a shape push against it at any second, but nothing happened. The rain kept pouring, making it hard to hear exactly what was happening outside. Time dragged on. The noise continued, and then, out of nowhere, it stopped. The only thing left was the sound of rain. I didn't move. I sat there in complete silence, waiting to hear anything else. But it was so quiet now that even the jungle seemed still, too still. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, gripping my flashlight, staring at the tent walls, listening for the slightest hint of sound. The rain finally began to ease up, and by the time the sun started to rise, the jungle was back to its normal noises. Birds calling, insects buzzing. Everything seemed fine again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. When daylight finally came, I crawled out of the tent. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain. As I walked around the tent, I saw what I had feared. The mud around the tent had been disturbed, and there were deep, long drag marks circling the tent. They were too wide for any animal I knew of. Whatever had been out there had walked all the way around my tent, multiple times, dragging something heavy behind it. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, trying not to think about what could have left those marks. As I hurried to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet, that maybe it was still watching, waiting for me to come back. And deep down, I knew I'd never really know what it was. Something in those woods wasn't meant to be found, and I wasn't going to stay long enough to find out why. I had always dreamed of visiting every country in the world, but this time, I decided to stay closer to home. I packed my things and drove to a secluded forest in the United States. The tall trees and the sounds of nature felt like a perfect break from my busy life. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and enjoyed the quiet around me as the sun went down. When night came, I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and listening to the sounds of the woods. I felt calm, surrounded by the rustling leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The stars above were bright, twinkling against the dark sky. But as the night went on, a feeling of unease crept in. The forest was too quiet now. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was in nature, and it was normal to feel a bit anxious while camping alone. Around midnight, I heard a soft noise in the distance, like someone moving through the bushes. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. But the sound kept getting closer. It felt too heavy to be a small animal. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear better. Suddenly, the noise stopped, and a cold silence fell over the campsite. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The light cut through the darkness, shining on the trees, but there was nothing there. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just another camper passing by. But I hadn't seen anyone on my way in, and the trailhead was far enough away that I doubted anyone would be out this late. Just as I started to relax, I heard the noise again. This time it was much closer, like something large was moving through the bushes. I stood up, gripping my flashlight tightly, my mind racing with different thoughts. I considered packing up and leaving, but the idea of walking through the dark woods alone terrified me. Then I remembered my phone. I took it out to check for a signal, hoping I could call for help. No signal. I was completely alone. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash that broke the silence, followed by heavy footsteps. Panic rushed through me. I grabbed my backpack, ready to run, when I saw a dark figure just beyond the trees. My heart sank. It was too tall and wide to be any animal. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt frozen. The figure moved closer, and I finally made a decision. I turned and sprinted into the woods, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground felt uneven beneath my feet. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to put as much space between me and that figure as I could. My breath came in quick gasps, and my legs burned, but I kept pushing myself forward. After what felt like forever, I stumbled onto an old dirt road. I didn't know where it led, but I had to take my chances. I followed it, praying it would lead me back to my car or at least somewhere safe. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. As I walked down the road, the trees started to thin, and soon I could see the lights of a distant town. Relief flooded over me. I had finally made it out of the forest. Safety was just ahead, or so I thought. When I reached the edge of town, I spotted a diner still open and hurried inside. The warmth and light felt like a relief, but the feeling of safety was short-lived. I ordered a coffee and sat down, my heart still racing. The waitress glanced at me, her eyes wide with concern, and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I didn't want to explain what had just happened. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. I glanced out the window at the dark road leading back into the woods. What if it had followed me? The thought chilled me to the bone. I looked around the diner, noticing the other customers chatting and laughing, completely unaware of what had happened just moments ago. My pulse quickened as I imagined that figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting for the next chance to strike. Looking back, I realized camping in the forest wasn't just about escaping. It was a reminder that the wild is full of unknowns, can be beautiful but also terrifying. I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp alone again. And as I finished my coffee and stepped outside, I felt the cold grip of fear wrap around me. The darkness was deep, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, following me, waiting for the right moment to come back. The sun was going down as I set up camp in a clearing deep in the forest. My wife, Lisa, and I had been looking forward to this trip for months, wanting to escape the noise of our busy lives. The tall trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows, and the air smelled strongly of pine. As I took out our gear, I felt a thrill of excitement. That first night, we sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and sway. Lisa always loved being outdoors, and I enjoyed seeing her so happy. As we roasted marshmallows, a calmness washed over us. The sounds of the forest wrapped around us like a warm blanket, making everything feel perfect. But as the fire burned low, a strange noise broke the quiet. It wasn't the wind. It came from deeper in the trees. Lisa noticed it too, and her smile faded. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some small animal. We decided to go to bed, tired from the hike. I woke up later, feeling uneasy. The darkness outside felt heavy and thick. I looked over at Lisa, but she wasn't in the tent. Panic surged in my chest. I crawled out, calling her name softly, worried I might disturb the peace of the night. The forest was disturbingly quiet now. I stepped away from the tent, my flashlight cutting through the blackness. I swept the light around, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. As I ventured deeper into the trees, the rustling returned, louder this time, almost like footsteps. My heart raced as I called out again, but silence answered me. I fought the urge to run back to the tent. Instead, I kept searching, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted her backpack lying near some bushes. I rushed over, my fear growing. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Her jacket was on the ground, ripped and stained. I bent down, feeling sick as I noticed drops of blood on the leaves nearby. With dread gripping me, I followed the trail deeper into the forest. Each step felt heavier than the last. The rustling returned, now sounding even closer. I reached a small clearing and froze. In the pale moonlight, I saw her. Lisa was lying on the ground, completely still. I rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. I could see she was alive, but barely. Her eyes opened slightly, filled with confusion and fear. I didn't know what had happened. Looking around, I noticed signs of a struggle, broken branches and disturbed earth. I gently shook her, begging her to stay awake. "We need to get out of here," I thought, knowing she couldn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, and my panic rose higher. I quickly checked for injuries, but I wasn't a doctor. All I could think of was getting her to safety. I wrapped my arms around her and lifted her up, trying to stay calm as I turned back toward our campsite. The rustling returned, this time sounding menacing. I hurried through the trees, every snap of a twig echoing in the silence. Finally, I spotted the glow of our campfire in the distance. I pushed forward, feeling the weight of Lisa in my arms. When I reached the tent, I laid her down gently and quickly grabbed my phone to call for help. The rustling grew louder, almost like a growl, and I could feel fear gripping my heart. I dialed emergency services, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Just then, I heard footsteps coming closer and looked up. My heart sank as I saw a figure stepping out of the shadows. A man, wild-eyed and disheveled, standing just outside the light. "Help her!" I yelled, but the figure just stared at me with a twisted smile creeping across his face. My mind raced. There was no time. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at him, trying to buy myself some time. "Stay away from us!" I shouted, my voice shaking. Then he lunged forward, and I reacted on instinct. I threw my flashlight at him, narrowly missing as I grabbed Lisa's backpack and swung it like a weapon. The man hesitated, caught off guard, giving me just enough time to grab Lisa and pull her into the tent. I zipped it up quickly, holding my breath, praying it would keep him out. I could hear him outside, pacing and mumbling to himself, sending chills down my spine. My phone was still connected, and I whispered our location to the operator, my voice barely above a whisper. The minutes felt like hours as I listened to him moving around, searching for a way in. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The figure froze, and hope surged through me. The sounds of sirens grew louder, and I could see red and blue lights flashing outside the tent. In that moment, I thought we were finally safe. But just as the sirens got closer, the man laughed softly, a sound that sent ice through my veins. "You think they can save you?" he whispered, his voice low and taunting. "This is just the beginning." The authorities arrived, scattering him off into the woods. As they rushed Lisa away, I stood there, still in shock. The beauty of the forest around us was now tainted by what we had just faced. As I left the forest behind, I knew this trip had changed us forever. Every tree, every shadow now felt threatening. I promised myself I would never take our safety for granted again. But as I looked back at the dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only seen the tip of something much darker lurking just beneath the surface. The haunting laughter of that man echoed in my mind, a reminder that danger could be hiding anywhere, waiting for the next chance to strike. After I retired from the police, I thought a camping trip would be the perfect way to clear my head. My career had been long, and I was looking forward to some peace. I found a quiet spot far from any campgrounds, deep in the woods. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise and people. Years of dealing with stress had taken its toll, and I needed the break. The first day went fine. I put up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made dinner as the sun dipped below the trees. Being alone out there felt calming, like the quiet nights when I used to patrol empty streets. But this was different. No radio, no backup, no need to watch my back. Just me and the forest. As the sun disappeared, the woods grew dark and still. The only sound was the fire crackling beside me. I stared into the flames, letting my thoughts wander. But after a while, that old feeling started creeping in. The one I'd had on the job, the feeling that something wasn't right. I hadn't seen or heard anything strange, but it was there, deep in my gut. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the area. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no animals, no wind, just the quiet forest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe all those years in law enforcement had left me jumpy. Maybe I was imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't leave. I got up and walked around my camp a few times, checking everything. Still nothing. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I went into my tent and zipped it up, lying there with my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. Hours went by, and all I heard was the occasional breeze rustling the leaves, but nothing else. Then, sometime early in the morning, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, followed by the snapping of twigs. My heart raced. I knew the sounds animals made, and this wasn't one of them. The steps were slow and steady, like someone was moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise. Whoever it was, they were right outside. I sat up quietly, grabbed my flashlight and knife, and listened. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds as if they were waiting or maybe watching. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just sat there, holding my breath, hoping they'd move on. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Nothing. No more movement. After a while, I decided I had to look. I unzipped the tent slowly, my flashlight ready, and shined the light outside. The camp was empty. Everything was just as I had left it, but I knew someone had been there. I could feel it deep in my bones. The rest of the night, I sat up, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. My eyes stayed locked on the tent door, but nothing else happened. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and got out of there. I didn't care how long it took. I just wanted to leave. About a mile from where I had camped, I found them. Footprints. They weren't mine and they weren't from any animal. These were boot prints and they followed the same trail I had walked the day before. They came from deep in the woods, passed right by my camp, and continued down the trail. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing by. They had watched me. They could have come right up to my tent if they wanted to. They chose not to. That's what bothers me the most. They didn't do anything, didn't make a sound, just walked around and left. I left the mountains without looking back. I've been in dangerous situations before, but nothing felt as unsettling as knowing I was being watched and that whoever it was had no good reason to be there. Those woods aren't the peaceful escape I thought they were. The quiet is too deep, too empty, like it's hiding something. I've learned that no matter where you go, even in the most remote places, you're never really alone. Someone is always out there, watching, waiting. They might not show themselves, but they're there. And next time, they might not leave you alone. Last summer, I went camping with my son. He's a sergeant now, tough as they come, and had been wanting us to get out into the woods again like we used to. We picked a spot deep in the forest, far away from the regular paths where people hike. That's how he likes it. The air was cool, the trees were thick, and the ground was soft under our boots. We set up camp pretty fast. My son was all focused, making sure everything was just right, checking our stuff and looking around the area. The first night was easy. We ate, talked a little, then got into our tents. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get out there in the wild. The next day, we went on a long hike. He led the way, and I stayed close behind him. I could see how his military training kicked in, the way he moved, always watching, always on alert. It made me feel safe, like nothing could go wrong with him nearby. But by the third night, something felt off. We were sitting by the fire, and I noticed my son kept looking into the trees. First, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a habit he picked up in the army. But then I heard it too, soft crunching sounds, just outside the light of the fire. Could have been an animal, I thought, a deer or something, but the noise didn't stop. Every few minutes it came back, moving from one side of the camp to the other. My son got up and started looking into the dark, scanning the trees. He gave me a look that said we should put the fire out. The second the flames went out, the noise stopped too. We sat there, not saying anything, just listening. Nothing. It was dead quiet. I started to think maybe we were both just hearing things, that it was all in our heads. But my son didn't think so. He quietly moved around, checking everything one more time, and then motioned for us to stay put and wait until morning. That night, neither of us got much sleep. We heard the same sounds, like something was moving around the camp, but it never came close enough for us to see what it was. By the time the sun started coming up, the noises were gone. We didn't waste any time packing up and getting out of there. But as we walked back along the trail, we saw footprints in the dirt. They weren't from any animal. They were human. Bare feet, no shoes, and they had circled our camp all night. The tracks came close to where our tents were, then backed off into the woods. We didn't say a word, but we both knew what it meant. Someone had been watching us the whole time, sneaking around in the dark. The feeling of being followed stayed with me even after we got back to the car. My son didn't say much, but I could see the tension on his face. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the trees. I knew someone had been out there watching us, waiting. We didn't hear them leave. We didn't hear them run off or walk away. They just stopped moving when the sun came up. But they were still out there, hiding in the trees. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They didn't make a mistake. They had been patient, too patient. And I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they weren't done watching us yet. My wife and I needed to get away from the busy city and all its noise, so we decided to go camping deep in the woods. We found a spot far away from other campers. It was quiet, just the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere far off. At first, it felt peaceful, but after a while, that silence started to feel too deep, like something wasn't right. The first night was okay. We set up our tent, made a fire, and cooked our dinner. The stillness was nice in a way, but by the second day, I started noticing small things that felt off. I'd find branches broken in strange ways, like they'd been snapped by something too strong to be a deer. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe just the wind. But something about it kept bothering me. Later that day, I went looking for more firewood and came across a tree about 50 feet away from our campsite. It had strange carvings in its bark. These weren't just scratches. They looked like someone had hacked into the tree with something sharp. The carvings were deep, rough shapes, almost like figures standing in a circle, all facing inward. There was something about them that felt wrong, like they were there on purpose. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't want to worry her over something that could just be a strange coincidence. But that night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about those carvings. It felt like we weren't really alone out there. We eventually crawled into the tent and tried to get some sleep, but it was hard. The air felt heavy, like something thick was pressing down around us. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, moving in a circle around our tent. I froze, just listening. They'd stop, then start again, closer each time. It sounded like someone was pacing, right outside. My heart was pounding, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to see out. There, standing at the edge of the trees about 30 feet away, was a man. He was tall, thin, and filthy, with wild hair tangled up with leaves and twigs, like he had been living in the forest itself. His clothes were dirty and blended in with the trees, like he was part of them. He stood with his back to me, facing into the woods, his head tilted as if he was listening to something. In his hands, he held 2 pieces of wood, rubbing them together slowly. I ducked back into the tent, my heart racing, unsure what to do. We were deep in the woods with no way to call for help. Part of me thought about grabbing a knife, but I knew it wouldn't be enough out here, miles away from anyone. The footsteps started again, louder this time, moving in slow circles around us. They never stopped, like he was waiting. We lay there in silence, listening to him walk around the tent until the first light of dawn finally broke through. When the sun was up, the footsteps stopped. We packed up as fast as we could, throwing everything in the car, not even talking to each other. The air felt wrong, like the trees were closing in on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I started driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was there, standing at the edge of the road, watching us leave. That night, back at home, I couldn't get him out of my mind. The way he'd moved, the way he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. I remembered the carvings on the tree, the rough figures all standing in a circle, facing each other. That's when I realized they weren't random shapes. They were people like us, standing together, facing each other in silence. It hit me then that he had been waiting for something, waiting for us. And out there, in the dark of the woods, there were probably others. Other people who had come before us, drawn into that silent circle, now just marks on a tree. It was like he was part of the woods, and now he had seen us like he'd made his choice. And as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, someday, I'd hear those footsteps again, closer this time, just outside my door. I'd set up my tent in a quiet spot high up in the mountains, far from any trails or people. The rain had started off as a light sprinkle earlier in the evening, but by the time it got dark, it had turned into a full-on downpour. I could hear the rain pounding against the tent, a constant sound that drowned out everything else. The ground underneath me was slowly turning into mud, and I could feel the wetness seeping through, chilling me from below. I was completely alone, and with every minute, that loneliness seemed to grow stronger. The wind picked up, shaking the trees all around me. Every gust seemed stronger than the last, and soon the branches above were creaking and swaying in the dark, as if they were warning me. I tried to ignore the growing feeling of unease creeping up my back, but the storm made everything feel tense, like something was out there, hiding just beyond my tent. Then, through the noise of the storm, I noticed something strange. In the middle of the rain and wind, I heard a dull thud. I froze, straining my ears to listen through the pounding rain. Another thud. It was close, closer than I wanted to believe. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch falling or maybe a rock tumbling down the hill. But the sounds kept coming, and they weren't steady like rain or shifting branches. They seemed too heavy, like slow steps coming right toward me. I sat there, barely breathing, listening as the steps grew louder, circling my tent. My mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. Maybe a lost animal or some hiker off the trail. But then I remembered just how remote this place was. I'd hiked for miles off the main path, and in this weather, no one would be out here wandering in the storm. The footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. I couldn't see anything. I hadn't brought a lantern, just a small flashlight that was already starting to dim from use. I clutched it tightly, hoping the rain would cover the sound of my quick, heavy breathing. Then, slowly, I felt the side of my tent pressing inward. Something was pushing on the thin fabric, carefully, almost like it was testing it. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I watched the wall of the tent bow under the pressure. This wasn't an animal, it was too careful, too controlled. Someone or something was outside, just standing there, listening, feeling along the edges of my tent. After what felt like hours, the pressure finally stopped, and I heard the footsteps again, moving away into the storm. I sat there, holding my breath, and waited, but the footsteps didn't return. When I finally dared to move, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a crack, shining the light outside. The rain poured down, but I could see deep footprints in the mud, circling my tent and leading off into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, waiting for the sun, feeling the heavy cold of the rain sink deeper into me. When dawn finally came, I packed up and left as fast as I could. But as I hiked out of that clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, hidden somewhere in those thick, dark woods, waiting for me to let my guard down. And as I looked over my shoulder one last time, I spotted something strange. Among the trees, just far enough to be nearly out of sight, was a shape, a figure motionless, barely visible in the shadows. It stood there, perfectly still, like it had been there all along, watching me with a patience that felt inhuman. I didn't wait to find out if it would follow. My neighbor, Miguel, and I had become close friends over the years. We worked out together at the gym, and since we lived in the same neighborhood, we often talked about our weekends and things going on in our lives. One day, Miguel came up with the idea that we should go camping in the Andes Mountains, a place he said would be a perfect break from the city noise. Surrounded by mountains, forests, and open sky, we packed up our stuff, loaded the car, and drove far out into the mountains. The more we hiked, the colder the air got, sharp and biting even through our jackets. But it was beautiful out there. Snowy peaks stretched as far as we could see, and the thick trees around us looked ancient, almost untouched. Just as the sun began to set behind the mountains, we found a small clearing and decided to make camp there. That night, the cold was intense, sinking deep into my bones. We sat by the fire, mostly silent, just listening to the crackle of burning wood and the faint sounds of animals in the distance. As I sat there, I felt a strange silence, a weight in the air, like something pressing in on my ears. It was almost suffocating, but I pushed the feeling aside, thinking it was just the quiet of the mountains, unlike anything I'd felt before. The first night went by with no problems. The second day, we decided to hike higher up the mountain. By the time it was getting dark, we found a flat ledge that overlooked a deep valley, so we set up our tent there. From that spot, the forest below looked like an endless sea of dark green, stretching out as far as we could see. Miguel and I snapped a few pictures, then got ready for bed, thinking we'd see even more in the morning. Around midnight, I suddenly woke up. The air inside the tent felt strangely heavy, as if something was pressing down on us. Miguel was fast asleep beside me, so I quietly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the pitch-black night, showing nothing but trees and shadows outside. But then I heard it. It was far away, but it was clear, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps crunching slowly through dried leaves. I froze, holding my breath to listen. The sound was coming from the forest below us, echoing up from somewhere in the dark trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I listened closer, I realized it was too steady, too heavy, with a slow rhythm that no animal would make. It sounded exactly like footsteps, slow, steady, and deliberate. For hours, I lay there, listening to those footsteps moving back and forth below us, never getting closer, but never fading away either. Whoever or whatever was down there seemed to be pacing, covering the same ground over and over, as if it were waiting for something. At one point, I thought I saw a faint, dim light moving between the trees, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, Miguel and I packed up as fast as we could. We didn't talk about the footsteps or the strange light from the night before. As we hiked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, hidden in the trees, watching us leave. But everything around us was silent, almost too silent, like the forest was holding its breath. When we finally got back to the main road, Miguel paused and looked back at the mountains one last time. His face was pale and he looked uneasy, like he'd felt it too. I didn't need to ask. I knew he'd heard it, those slow, steady footsteps pacing in the dark. I never went back to those mountains, and neither did Miguel. We never spoke about that night again. But sometimes, late at night, I lie awake, hearing those footsteps in my mind, slow, unending, like they're still out there, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day, someone will be foolish enough to camp there again, to hear those footsteps pacing closer, step by step, until it's too late to leave. It was late summer, and my uncle and aunt decided to take me camping in a quiet part of the woods. I was really looking forward to it. We drove for hours, finally reaching a hidden campsite surrounded by tall trees and a calm lake. The sun was going down, painting everything in orange light. My uncle set up the tent while my aunt got a fire going. As night came, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. The forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and sometimes a distant animal making noise. After a while, my aunt went to bed, leaving my uncle and me sitting by the fire. I loved being out here, feeling free and wild. Later, my uncle suggested a quick night hike. I was excited and agreed right away. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped into the cool, dark woods. At first, it was fun, wandering along the trails and shining our lights on the trees. But soon, the air turned colder, and the silence felt heavier. My uncle pointed out some animal tracks, and I felt a thrill, picturing the creatures that roamed this place. As we went deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. A low, creepy sound, almost like a soft growl. I turned to my uncle, but he was already walking ahead, his flashlight beam bouncing in the distance. I hurried to catch up, my heart racing. The sound grew louder, more intense, like it was coming from somewhere off the trail. We pressed on, and then I heard something move in the bushes nearby. My stomach dropped. It didn't feel like just an animal. I had this weird feeling that we were being watched. I caught up to my uncle, who had stopped, his flashlight pointing at something in the shadows. I couldn't see what it was, but a chill ran down my spine. Without saying a word, we turned around and picked up the pace. That creepy sound followed us, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as we rushed through the darkness, the flashlight beams flickering. Each snap of a twig made me jump. The trees felt like they were closing in around us, and the night seemed more alive than ever. Finally, we reached the campsite. My aunt was sitting by the fire, looking puzzled as she stared at our faces. My uncle and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. "What happened?" my aunt asked, but we were too shaken to respond. My uncle just shook his head, still staring into the woods like he was waiting for something to come out. We decided to pack up early in the morning. The sounds of the forest felt different now, less friendly. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees. It was then I noticed something in the shadows, two glowing eyes watching us. My heart sank. That camping trip was supposed to be fun, but now it felt like something dark was lurking in those woods, waiting. I realized that nature, while beautiful, can also be deeply unsettling. That night would haunt me every time I thought of it, and I knew I'd never forget those eyes watching from the dark, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. It was a warm weekend in late summer when my wife, her mother, and I decided to go camping. We found a spot near a small lake surrounded by thick trees, far from the noise of the city. I wanted to get closer to my mother-in-law, hoping this trip would be a good way to connect. As we set up our tent, I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves seemed strangely far away. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just because we were in such a remote place. After we got settled in, we spent the day fishing and roasting hot dogs over the fire. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campsite. Later, as darkness fell, I sat by the fire while my wife and her mother got their sleeping bags ready inside the tent. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering light against the dark trees. I watched the smoke rise, thinking about how peaceful it felt, but something bothered me. An uneasy feeling creeping in as the night deepened. Around midnight, I heard a rustling sound coming from the woods. It wasn't the usual nighttime noises. This was heavier, almost like something was moving on purpose. I stood up, trying to see through the dark. A chill ran down my spine. The rustling stopped, replaced by a silence that felt too thick. I wanted to wake my wife, but I hesitated, thinking maybe it was just an animal. The next hour dragged on. I kept looking toward the trees, feeling like someone was watching me. I tried to push away the fear, telling myself it was nothing. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A dark shape slipped between the trees, just beyond the light of my flashlight. My heart raced. I pointed the light in that direction, but nothing was there. I decided to check on my mother-in-law and wife. As I unzipped the tent, I saw them both sound asleep, their faces relaxed. I almost felt bad for waking them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Suddenly, I heard it again, a loud snap of a branch. This time it was closer. I stepped outside the tent, holding the flashlight tightly. I could see a figure standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by shadows. It looked like a man, but he was just standing there, not moving. My breath caught in my throat, and panic rushed through me. I tried to call out for my wife, but no sound came out. My body felt frozen as I shined the light toward the figure. It stepped back into the darkness, and I quickly ran inside the tent, zipping it up tight. I felt like a coward, but I couldn't face whatever was out there. The next few hours felt like a nightmare. I lay awake, heart pounding, listening for any sound that might mean the figure was gone. Finally, just as dawn broke, the world outside woke up with chirping birds and the sound of leaves moving in the breeze. Felt like a new day, but I still couldn't shake the fear. When my wife and her mother woke up, I told them what happened. They laughed, thinking it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But I couldn't forget the fear that had gripped me. We decided to pack up early. As we left the campsite, I spotted something in the dirt. A deep footprint leading into the trees, much larger than any animal's. I didn't say anything to them, but the sight of that footprint sent chills through me. I had tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my imagination. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us all night. I told myself it was just a camping trip, but deep down, I knew I'd never feel safe in the woods again. Then, as we turned onto the main road, I glanced back at the campsite. The trees looked darker now, almost as if they were closing in. A thought struck me. What if that figure was still out there, watching? The more I thought about it, the more the fear bubbled up inside me. I remembered how still the night had been, how the usual sounds of nature had vanished. I recalled that heavy silence after the rustling stopped, how it felt like the world was holding its breath. I looked at my wife and her mother, who were chatting about the trip. They had no idea of the real danger we had faced. Then, in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement in the trees. My heart sank. I didn't say anything, but the image of that dark shape loomed in my mind. I drove faster, desperate to put distance between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. As we finally reached the city, I took a deep breath, but it did nothing to ease my worry. The woods might have looked peaceful during the day, but I knew the truth. We were lucky to leave, but whatever was out there was still lurking, waiting for the next chance to come closer. The fear settled in my chest, a reminder that some places hold secrets best left alone, and some shadows never truly fade away.